Listen here now, children of memory. Come close to this fire that burns low but never dies. Don't bring no hurry with you, no sir. This here story don't like to run. It walks slow, like somebody carrying invisible chains round the ankles of the soul. I'm speaking of a time when the earth drank black blood and called it harvest. I'm speaking of a woman whose name still whispers in the hot clay of the deep south, Isabella of the Ants. Lord have mercy on my tongue, but I seen her. Not with these tired old eyes, no. I seen her with the eyes I inherited from them that came chained in the belly of slave ships. Eyes that learned to see even in the dark of the Middle Passage, where the ocean swallowed screams and gave back nothing but salt and sorrow. Isabella, she wasn't born free. Sweet Jesus, no. She was born already owing her body, her breath, and her silence to men who counted souls like cotton bales. Her mama was a woman torn from the Gold Coast, sold twice before she learned to speak crooked English, words that sat heavy and wrong in her mouth like broken teeth. That woman carried Africa in her bones, but the plantation ground tried to beat it out, tried to make her forget the songs, the names, the prayers whispered under baobab trees 10,000 miles away across that cruel water. Isabella grew up in a cotton field, lost between swamps and trails of red ant mounds, hot land, infested with insects and with men worse than them. Suffering so bad that place was. Every tree there knew a lament. Every fence post guarded secrets buried in haste when the paddy rollers rode by. The slave quarters creaked at night like they was trying to run away from the ground itself. And right in the center of that hell stood the overseer, a man whose name don't deserve remembering, because names is also honor, and that devil had none. He rode his horse like he owned even the wind, and his pleasure was teaching pain. Folks swear on their lives they seen him smile when the whip cracked, seen him laugh when grown men cried. That's the kind of evil that walks upright, talks smooth, and sleeps sound. Isabella was small of body but great in silence. She learned early that speaking could cost you skin, and looking in the wrong eyes could cost you life. Just a child, barely 10 summers old, she watched her brother get taken to the auction block down in Charleston, hands tied behind his back, mouth pried open so white men could count his teeth like he was livestock. She seen her mama scream until her voice broke, then seen her lose her mind piece by piece after that. The madness took her slow, like roots rotting from rain. That scream never left Isabella. It stayed inside, festering, turning into something else, something patient and terrible. In them days of deep sorrow, a child learned to hold rage like a secret, to let it age like gopher dust buried at the crossroads under a moonless sky. The old ones warned, revenge that comes quick burns out fast, but revenge that waits, Lord of glory, that kind changes the very ground it walks on. The quarters where Isabella slept was a crooked cabin with gaps in the walls wide enough to see stars through. Dirt floor, one blanket for 3 souls, and the smell of sweat and sickness that never left. At night she'd hear the spirituals sung low, coded messages about rivers to cross and northern stars to follow. Wade in the water, they'd sing, and everybody knew it meant more than baptism. Isabella listened. She remembered. And she waited. Now you see, people, the conflict that shaped Isabella didn't come all at once like a thunderclap. No, sir. It came slow, deliberate, like water wearing down stone. The plantation she lived on, Wexford Plantation they called it, though that name tasted like ash in black folks' mouths, sat deep in the Georgia red clay country, where the summer heat could kill a strong-backed man before noon, and the mosquitoes rose from the swamps, thick as smoke. The big house stood on a hill, white columns gleaming like bones in the sun, while down below in the quarters, life was measured in survival and prayer. Master Wexford himself was a distant figure, a shadow behind lace curtains who left the dirty work to his overseer. And that overseer, that man without mercy, he made it his business to break spirits methodically, one by one, like a craftsman perfecting his cruelest art. Isabella was maybe 12, 13 years old when the ritual began. She'd been working the cotton fields since she could walk, fingers bleeding from the bowls, back bent under that skin and heat that made the air shimmer and dance. One day, working alongside her mama, what was left of her mama anyway, the shell that grief had hollowed out, Isabella made a mistake, dropped a basket, simple as that, just dropped it. The overseer was on her before the cotton hit the ground, riled up, full of rage for no reason bigger than his own meanness. "You clumsy wench," he spit, voice like gravel and hate. "You need teaching." And right there he introduced her to the fire ants. There was a mound near the edge of the field, massive thing, red and seething with life. The old folks said them mounds was older than the plantation itself, that the ants there remembered when this land belonged to Creek and Cherokee, before the cotton and the chains. The overseer grabbed Isabella by her thin arm and dragged her to that mound, while the other field hands looked away, heavy-hearted, knowing what came next. He pushed her down onto it, held her there. The ants came fast, Lord have mercy. They came like tiny demons, crawling up her legs, her arms, biting with fire that felt like hot needles going straight to bone. Isabella screamed. Of course she screamed, she was just a child. But the overseer held her down and laughed like it was music. When he finally let her up, her skin was welted and swollen, her eyes wild with pain and shock. The other enslaved people helped her to the creek, washed her in the cool water, whispered prayers over her in African tongues mixed with broken English. Her mama held her and rocked her, but the light in that woman's eyes was already gone to some far-off place where the mind goes to hide from unbearable things. But here's what the overseer didn't know, what he couldn't see with his narrow, cruel eyes. That first time on the ant mound planted something in Isabella. Not just fear, not just hate, something deeper, more ancient. The root doctors would later say she was marked that day, chosen by the earth itself to carry out a reckoning, written in blood and clay. From that day on, the overseer made Isabella's punishment his favorite entertainment. Whenever he was vexed, whenever he wanted to show his power, whenever he just felt the itch for cruelty, he'd drag her to the ant mound. And Isabella, young as she was, learned something that would save her and damn him. She learned to endure. She learned to go somewhere inside herself where the ants couldn't reach, learned to breathe like her grandmother had taught her in whispered secrets, learned to count the bites like rosary beads. The other enslaved folks started calling her Isabella of the Ants, though never loud enough for white ears to hear. They saw something changing in her, saw how she stopped crying after the 10th time, the 20th time, saw how her eyes got distant but sharp, like she was studying something the rest of them couldn't see. In the quiet of the quarters at night, the old conjure woman would look at Isabella and nod slow, knowing. She'd seen this before, this transformation that pain can bring when it don't kill you. Suffering creature, they called her. But also, in whispers, woman of steel. The plantation ground carried heavy spirits, always did. But after Isabella's trials began, folks swear the very air changed. The mockingbird stopped singing near the ant mound. Dogs wouldn't go near it after sundown. Even the overseer's horse would shy and snort when passing close, nostrils flaring like it smelled death waiting patient in the red Georgia clay. 200 times. Let me say it again so it settles in your bones. 200 times that man threw Isabella onto that seething mound of fire ants. Not 2, not 20, 200. Each time was a lesson in endurance, a brutal education in the limits of human suffering and the bottomless depths of human cruelty. Some days it was for nothing, just because he woke up mean. Other days it was for invented infractions, looking up when she should look down, moving too slow, moving too fast, breathing too loud. The plantation became a theater of horror with Isabella as its unwilling star. Other enslaved people were forced to watch sometimes, a warning written in welts and screams. The overseer wanted them to see what happened to those who didn't break properly, who held something back in their eyes that he couldn't touch. But what he didn't understand, what his kind never understood, was that witnesses remember, testimony lives, and debt accumulates like thunderclouds before the storm. Isabella's body became a map of bites and scars, her skin tough as leather in some places, forever sensitive in others. But while her flesh suffered, her mind worked. Lord of glory, how it worked. She began to study the mound like a scholar, to know it intimate as a lover. She learned where the queen nested deep below, where the chambers branched and connected. She learned how long it took for the workers to swarm, how they communicated through scent and touch, how they carried their dead to specific burial sites away from the colony. She learned that the ants built their empire on order, on knowing exactly where every member belonged, on defending their home with coordinated fury. And in that terrible education, Isabella found something like kinship. The ants didn't ask permission to exist. They didn't apologize for their bite. They simply were, and they protected what was theirs with everything they had. Old folks say that during this time, Isabella started talking to the mound. Not out loud where ears could hear, but in her spirit, in that place where prayers live before they become words. She'd lie there during the torment and whisper promises in her grandmother's tongue, bargains made with the earth and the insects and the ancestors who watched from beyond the veil. If you teach me to survive this, she'd pray, I'll teach him to fear it. The conjure woman from the quarters, ancient sister named Auntie Ruth, started leaving things for Isabella. A mojo bag with graveyard dirt and red pepper, a bottle tree planted outside her cabin to catch evil spirits, whispered instructions about which roots to chew for pain, which prayers to say when the moon was dark. Auntie Ruth never said it straight, but everyone knew. She was preparing Isabella for something, crossing and uncrossing paths that hadn't been walked yet. By the 100th time on the mound, Isabella had stopped screaming. By the 150th, she'd stopped flinching. By the 200th, something in her eyes made even the overseer pause, though his pride wouldn't let him see the danger. That look she carried wasn't submission. It was calculation. It was a debt ledger written in blood and bites, and every entry was dated, witnessed, and waiting for collection. The plantation ground knew. The ants knew. The ancestors knew. Only the overseer, drunk on his own power and cheap rum, remained blind to the truth that anyone with eyes to see could read plain. Isabella of the ants was no longer the victim. She was becoming the instrument of something older than cotton, deeper than chains, more patient than any white man's cruelty could imagine. She was becoming justice itself, red and crawling and inevitable as the Georgia sun. And the earth, that red clay earth that had drunk so much black blood and black tears, was ready to drink something different. It was ready to drink vengeance. It was ready to swallow whole a man who'd forgotten that all debts come due, and some creditors don't accept apologies. The old ones warned us, mess with the earth, pay dear. The overseer was about to learn that lesson written in chitin and fury, taught by a young woman who'd survived the impossible and learned to speak the language of the land itself. This here's where the story gets deep, children. This here's where memory becomes prophecy, and suffering becomes power. Hold tight now, 'cause what comes next will shake your bones. In them days of deep sorrow, the auction block stood in Charleston like a monument to sin, white stone stained with sweat and tears that no rain could wash clean. Isabella was maybe 7 years old when they took her brother Samuel to that cursed place. Samuel was strong-backed, healthy, with teeth white and straight, worth good money to the traders who dealt in human flesh like it was cotton or tobacco. The morning they came for him, the quarters woke to the sound of chains before dawn. Paddy rollers on horseback, their faces hard as the iron they carried, moving through the slave cabins like reapers through wheat. Isabella's mama knew before they even called Samuel's name. Mothers always know. She'd been feeling it in her bones for weeks, ever since Master Wexford's debts started piling up and the whiskey on his breath got heavier. Samuel was 14, old enough to work, young enough to have years of labor ahead of him. Prime stock, they'd say at the auction, like he was livestock instead of her brother who used to catch fireflies for her in mason jars, who taught her which berries in the woods was safe to eat, who sang spirituals in a voice that made even the overseers pause to listen. They bound his wrists with rope that cut into the skin. Isabella ran after them, small feet kicking up red dust, crying and grabbing at her brother's shirt until one of the paddy rollers backhanded her so hard she tasted blood. Samuel didn't fight. He couldn't. Fighting meant death right there in the dirt. So he walked head down while their mama screamed a sound that came from somewhere deeper than lungs, deeper than heart. A sound that came from the very soul tearing itself in pieces. The journey to Charleston took 3 days. Isabella and her mama weren't allowed to go, but they heard about it later from others who'd made that walk of sorrow. How the enslaved people were chained together in a coffle, neck to neck, walking barefoot over rough roads. How they slept in pens at night like animals. How some died on the way and were left in ditches, not even worthy of burial. At the auction block, Samuel stood in a line with 20 others, men, women, children, all scrubbed clean to look presentable, stripped to the waist so buyers could examine muscle and skin for scars that might indicate a rebellious spirit. The auctioneer was a fat man with a voice like thunder, calling out attributes like Samuel was a horse. Strong buck, good teeth, no whip marks, obedient temperament. White men circled, poking at Samuel's arms, prying open his mouth to count teeth, looking for hernias, checking his back for signs of previous punishment. Each touch was violation, each examination was theft of dignity, and Samuel stood there, eyes fixed on some distant point, going to that place inside where the spirit retreats when the body can't escape. He sold for $800 to a plantation owner from Mississippi. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Just like that, Samuel ceased to be Isabella's brother and became property moving west, toward cotton fields so vast they swallowed men whole and never gave them back. Back at Wexford Plantation, their mama waited by the road for 3 days straight, as if Samuel might somehow return. She didn't eat, didn't sleep, just stood there like a scarecrow, waiting for something that would never come. On the 4th day, something inside her broke that couldn't be fixed. She started talking to people who weren't there, answering questions nobody asked, laughing at nothing and crying at everything. Isabella watched her mama disappear into madness the way you watch a boat drift away from shore. Slow, inevitable, heartbreaking. The woman who birthed her was still there in body, but the mama who sang her to sleep, who braided her hair with gentle hands, who told stories about their people in Africa, that mama was gone, sold away just as surely as Samuel. Except she never left the plantation ground. This was Isabella's first lesson in the mathematics of slavery. Love was liability, family was weakness, and attachment was a chain heavier than iron. She learned that the masters could take anything, any time, for any reason, or no reason at all. She learned that pleading didn't help, that crying didn't help, that even a mother's grief couldn't stop the machinery of buying and selling human souls. The old ones say that's when Isabella's heart started turning to stone, when the softness that makes a child began hardening into something else. She stopped playing, stopped singing, started moving through the world like a ghost, doing her work with mechanical precision, speaking only when spoken to, keeping her eyes down, and her thoughts locked away where no master could reach them. But inside, where no one could see, she was counting. Counting days, counting hurts, counting debts that would one day need settling. And at the center of her ledger, written in invisible ink made of grief and rage, was the overseer's name. The man who'd laughed when Samuel was taken, who'd told her mama to shut her wailing or join her son in chains. The auction block broke Isabella's family, but it also forged something new in her, something cold and patient and absolutely certain. Justice might be blind, but vengeance sees everything, and vengeance, she learned from the ants, knows how to wait. The overseer's name was Silas Crow, though most enslaved folks just called him devil or worse. In whispers the night kept secret. He was a man built from meanness and cheap whiskey, standing maybe 6 feet tall with arms thick from years of swinging the whip and shoulders broad, from carrying the weight of his own cruelty without shame. Silas Crow wasn't born on the plantation. He came from poor white trash in the Carolina hills, the kind of man who had nothing but the color of his skin, and used it like a weapon to climb up from the mud. Master Wexford hired him because Silas had a reputation for keeping enslaved people in line without killing too many. Profitable cruelty, they called it. Just enough pain to break the spirit, but not so much it destroyed the body's ability to work. He wore a wide-brimmed hat stained with sweat, boots that came up to his knees, and carried a whip coiled at his belt like a snake waiting to strike. That whip had a name too. He called it Persuader, and it had tasted the blood of nearly every enslaved person on Wexford Plantation at some point. The leather was dark and supple from use, and the crack it made in the air could stop a heart before it even touched skin. Silas took pride in his work the way some men take pride in carpentry or farming. He saw himself as necessary, as the hard hand that kept chaos at bay, that maintained order in a world he believed was naturally divided between those who commanded and those who obeyed. In his mind, the enslaved people weren't fully human. They was somewhere between animal and person, needing firm guidance and harsh correction to keep them productive. But there was more to Silas's cruelty than just business. He enjoyed it. You could see it in his eyes when he dealt punishment, a kind of light that came on like someone had lit a lamp behind his pupils. He liked the power, the way people flinched when he walked by, the way grown men trembled at his voice. It fed something hungry and hollow inside him, something that no amount of violence could ever fill. His particular hatred for Isabella started simple enough. She didn't break the way others did. When he whipped her, she took it with silence. When he cursed her, she kept her eyes somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't reach. That drove him mad, that quiet resistance. So he invented the ant mound punishment specifically for her, thinking that would finally crack her spirit wide open. Silas lived in a small house between the big house and the quarters, a wooden structure that smelled of tobacco and unwashed clothes. He had no wife. What woman would have him? But he had other vices. The enslaved women knew to avoid his path after dark. Some couldn't avoid it, and those stories are too painful to tell in full, but they lived in the silence of the quarters, in the eyes that wouldn't meet each other at breakfast, in the babies born with features that made their parentage a shameful secret. Everyone knew, and nobody spoke. Every morning Silas would wake before dawn and walk the plantation grounds like a general inspecting his domain. He'd stop at the quarters, bang on doors with his rifle butt, shout for people to get moving. He knew every trick, every attempt to fake sickness, every hiding spot where someone might steal a few extra minutes of rest. His eyes was everywhere, his ears tuned to any sound of rebellion or complaint. The enslaved people feared him, yes, but they also studied him. They learned his rhythms, his weaknesses, his blind spots. They knew he drank heavy on Saturday nights, that his vision was poor in his left eye from a bar fight years ago, that he limped slightly when rain was coming. Information is power when you have no other kind, and the quarters collected information like squirrels collect nuts for winter. Isabella studied him most carefully of all. She memorized his schedule, his habits, his moods. She learned to read the weather of his temperament, when he was merely mean and when he was dangerous. She knew which days he'd seek her out for the ant mound, and learned to prepare herself mentally, to go to that deep place inside where pain couldn't reach her core. Over the years, as Isabella endured her 200 visits to the ant mound, Silas Crow became more than her tormentor. He became her obsession, her singular focus. Every bite from the ants was a lesson about him. Every moment of suffering was study. She learned that pride made him careless, that whiskey made him slow, that his cruelty made him predictable. The old conjure woman, Auntie Ruth, would tell Isabella, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, child. But the earth got its own tools, and them ants you suffering with, they don't belong to no master. They belong to themselves and to the ground remembers every drop of blood spilled on it." Silas Crow thought he was teaching Isabella fear, but all he was really doing was teaching her patience, endurance, and the exact measurements of the grave he was digging for himself. Every cruel act was another shovelful of dirt removed, another inch deeper into the earth that would eventually swallow him whole. Evil-hearted men never see their own end coming. They think their power is eternal, that the people they crush will stay crushed forever. But the old ones know better. What goes around comes around, and the wheel turns slow, but it turns sure. Silas Crow's wheel was turning, grinding toward a destination written in red clay and crawling things, and Isabella of the Ants was the one turning the handle. The first time Isabella was thrown onto the ant mound, she was 12 years old, and the world ended. Not the whole world, maybe, but her world. The small, careful space she'd built inside herself where hope still lived like a candle flame in wind. That flame went out the moment her body hit the seething red earth, and the fire ants came boiling up like demons summoned from hell itself. Listen here now, because this part is important. The mound wasn't small. It stood maybe 4 feet high and twice that wide, built over years by millions of tiny architects who'd claimed that patch of Georgia ground as their kingdom. The enslaved people avoided it, walked wide around it, knew it was sacred in a way that had nothing to do with churches or prayers. The ants there was fierce, their bite like hot needles dipped in poison, and they defended their territory with a fury that didn't care about human laws or master's orders. Silas Crow dragged Isabella there by her arm, his fingers digging bruises into her thin bicep. The other field hands watched with heavy hearts, some turning away because they couldn't bear to see, others forcing themselves to witness because testimony is a form of resistance too. If they looked away, if they pretended it didn't happen, then Silas's evil could exist without record, without conscience. "You need teaching," Silas said, voice thick with satisfaction. He pushed Isabella down onto the mound and held her there with his boot on her back, pressing her face into the red dirt. The ants responded immediately, hundreds of them, thousands, swarming over her exposed skin like a living blanket of fire. The pain was beyond description. It wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, existential, the kind of suffering that makes you question if God exists, or if he's just turned his face away from places like this. Isabella screamed. Of course she screamed. She was a child. The screams tore from her throat raw and animal, sounds she didn't know a human could make. Silas counted to 30 before he let her up. 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. When Isabella rolled away from the mound, her skin was covered in welts, her face swollen, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The other enslaved people carried her to the creek, laid her in the cool water, picked ants out of her hair and clothes while she whimpered and shook. That night in the quarters, Auntie Ruth came to see her. The old woman brought a poultice made from plantain leaves and clay, spread it over Isabella's bites with gentle hands, and whispered prayers in a language that predated English. That came from Africa and survived the Middle Passage hidden in the mouths of women who refused to let their people's words die. "This ain't gonna be the last time," Auntie Ruth said, quiet, her voice like dry leaves rustling. "That devil found something he think breaks you, and he gonna use it till either you break or he tire of it. So you gotta choose now, child. You gonna let it break you, or you gonna learn from it?" Isabella, through tears and pain, didn't answer. But something shifted in her eyes, something Auntie Ruth recognized because she'd seen it before in other people pushed past endurance into that strange territory where survival becomes art and patience becomes power. The second time came a week later. Same mound, same Silas, same screaming and suffering. But this time Isabella tried something different. She remembered what her grandmother had taught her before grief took the woman's mind: how to breathe through pain, how to separate the body from the spirit, how to float above suffering while the flesh endured below. It didn't work perfectly. The pain was still massive, overwhelming. But for just a few seconds, Isabella felt herself rise above it, felt her consciousness separate from the biting and burning. Those few seconds was like gold, precious and rare, something to build on. By the 10th time on the mound, Isabella had learned to last 60 seconds before screaming. By the 20th time, she could endure 2 minutes of silence. The other enslaved people started whispering about it, calling it a miracle or madness or both. How could someone withstand that suffering without sound? What kind of power did she have? The truth was simpler and harder than magic. Isabella was learning to master pain the way a blacksmith learns to master fire. Not by avoiding it, but by understanding it, by knowing its rhythms and limits, by accepting it as teacher rather than destroyer. The ants became her unwilling instructors, and every bite was a lesson in endurance. Silas noticed the change and hated it. He started holding her on the mound longer, pressing harder, seeking the breaking point he was sure must exist. 30 seconds became 1 minute, became 5 minutes, became 10. The ritual of punishment became an obsession for both of them. Silas trying to break her, Isabella trying to outlast him. The enslaved community watched this battle of wills with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some prayed for Isabella's death, thinking that would be mercy. Others prayed for her survival, sensing that something larger than one girl's suffering was unfolding. The old ones recognized it as a spiritual war, the kind where the battlefield is measured in flesh and blood, but the stakes reach all the way to ancestors and yet unborn children. By the 50th time, Isabella had stopped screaming entirely. She would lie on the mound silent, eyes open but seeing something else, something beyond the Georgia sky. The ants would swarm and bite, and she would breathe and count and memorize. She learned which parts of the mound was most active, where the queen likely nested, how the workers communicated, how the soldiers defended. This knowledge would matter later. Everything matters later when you're building toward revolution, one stolen breath at a time. But in those moments, Isabella was just surviving second by second, bite by bite, learning that the human spirit can endure things the human mind can't imagine. And the mound, that ancient colony of fire ants, was learning too. Learning the taste of a girl who would not break, learning the scent of patience and coming vengeance, preparing itself for a role it didn't yet know it would play. Executioner, judge, and final witness to evil eating itself alive. 200 times. Let me say it slow so you feel the weight of them numbers settling on your soul like chains. 200 times Isabella was thrown onto that fire ant mound. Not in 1 year, no. This was spread across 6 years of her life, from 12 years old to 18. 6 years of ritual torment, of Silas Crow making her suffering his favorite entertainment, his signature cruelty that other overseers heard about and came to witness like it was some kind of damned carnival show. The enslaved community on Wexford Plantation kept count. They marked it in ways white folks couldn't see. Scratches on cabin walls, knots tied in rope, songs with verses that added up to testimony. Every time Isabella went to the mound, someone was counting, someone was witnessing, someone was adding another line to the ledger of debts that would someday come due. By the 100th time, Isabella's body had changed in ways that frightened even the root doctors. Her skin where the ants bit most frequently had grown thick and scarred, tough as old leather. Some places had lost feeling entirely, nerve endings so damaged they no longer reported pain to her brain. Other places had become hypersensitive, where even a light touch felt like fire. She was a map of suffering, every inch of exposed skin telling a story of endurance that shouldn't have been possible. But it was her mind that changed most dramatically, and that's what the old ones paid attention to. Isabella stopped being a girl and became something else, a student of survival, a scholar of suffering, a woman being forged in fire and venom into an instrument of something the quarters didn't have a name for yet, but recognized in their bones. She learned the mound like a lover learns a body, knew where the main entrances was, where the secondary tunnels branched off, where the nursery chambers likely sat underground. She learned the ants' schedule, their rhythms, understood that they was most aggressive in the heat of midday and slightly less frenzied in early morning or evening. She learned which movements made them swarm faster, which positions minimized the areas they could reach. This knowledge came at terrible cost, paid in welts and fever and nights when her whole body shook with delayed reaction to venom accumulated in her blood. Sometimes she got so sick from the bites that the field hands thought she'd die, that this time Silas had finally pushed too far and Isabella would slip away into that darkness where all the suffering ended. But she never did. She'd lie there in her cabin sweating and shaking, and Auntie Ruth would feed her broths made from roots and bark, would sing prayers over her in Gula and Yoruba, would call on ancestors to hold tight to this child who was becoming something powerful and necessary. The other enslaved people started looking at Isabella differently, some with pity, yes, but others with something like awe. She was surviving the impossible, enduring what should have killed her or driven her mad. In a world where power meant white skin and property deeds, Isabella was discovering a different kind of power, The power of absolute endurance, of refusing to break no matter what hell was unleashed on her. Silas Crow noticed the change too, though his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. He increased the duration, the frequency, the brutality. What started as 30-second punishments stretched to 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. He'd hold her down with his full weight, grinding her face into the red clay while the ants swarmed, while she breathed through her nose and counted in her head and went to that faraway place where pain couldn't follow. By the 150th time, something strange started happening. The ants themselves seemed to recognize her. They'd still bite. That was their nature, their defense. But the frenzy was different. Some of the old field hands swore they seen it with their own eyes. Ants crawling on Isabella without biting, exploring her skin like they was confused, like they couldn't quite figure out if she was threat or terrain or something else entirely. Auntie Ruth explained it one night in whispers. The earth knows its own, child. You've been baptized in pain so many times that the ground recognize you now. Them ants, they part of the earth, and the earth is tired of white folks' cruelty. It's choosing sides, slow but sure, and it's choosing you. Isabella didn't feel chosen. She felt destroyed and rebuilt, broken down and reassembled, like something that had died and been resurrected, but come back different, harder, colder. The soft parts of her that used to feel compassion or hope or fear had calcified into something impenetrable. Love was dangerous. Weakness was fatal. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But hatred, Lord have mercy, hatred she could afford. Hatred was free, abundant, renewable. And patience, that other side of hatred's coin, was something she had in excess. Because Isabella had learned the most important lesson the ants could teach. Revenge doesn't have to be fast, doesn't have to be loud, doesn't have to announce itself. Revenge can wait, can plan, can prepare itself with the patience of a colony building its kingdom, one grain of sand at a time. By the 200th time, and nobody knew it was the 200th except Isabella herself, who kept perfect count in a mind that forgot nothing and forgave less, she had become something the plantation had never seen before. Not quite human in the way they'd tried to break her, not quite spirit in the way Auntie Ruth's prayers called to, but something in between. A woman who'd learned to speak the language of suffering so fluently that she could translate it into vengeance. The mound knew her, the ants knew her, the red Georgia clay knew her, and Silas Crow, fool that he was, had taught her everything she needed to know about him, his rhythms, his weaknesses, his patterns, his pride. He'd made her an expert in his own destruction, and was too drunk on power to realize it. The old ones say, what you do to others, you teach them to do to you. Silas Crow had been teaching Isabella for 6 years, and his final exam was coming. He just didn't know it yet. In the quiet of the quarters at night, when the masters slept and the paddy rollers rode distant roads, the enslaved people of Wexford Plantation would gather in whispers and coded songs to share what couldn't be spoken in daylight. And increasingly they spoke of Isabella, not with the pity they'd shown the broken child, but with something approaching reverence for the woman she was becoming. The ants had taught Isabella survival, but it was Auntie Ruth who taught her power. The old conjure woman was ancient beyond reckoning, had survived the Middle Passage as a child, carried Africa in her bones and her speech and her knowledge of roots and spirits that white folks called superstition, but black folks knew was deeper truth than any Bible verse. Come here, child, Auntie Ruth would call to Isabella after the worst sessions on the mound, when Isabella's body was swollen and fevered. Let me teach you what them ants trying to say. And she'd mix her poultices and potions while speaking in that low, rhythmic way that was half prayer, half lesson, all power. Them ants live by order, you see. Everyone knows its place, its purpose. Queen makes babies, workers feed and build, soldiers defend. Nobody questioning, nobody confused. But the power don't come from the queen, no matter what white folks think about their masters and kings. Power comes from the many moving as one, from knowing that together they stronger than any single boot that tries to crush them. Auntie Ruth taught Isabella about root work and conjure, about goofer dust made from graveyard dirt and sulfur, about mojo bags carried for protection or revenge, about the crossroads where the spirits gather at midnight to make deals with the desperate and the determined. She taught her which plants could heal and which could harm, which roots to chew for strength and which to brew for poison, though she always added, poison is a coward's weapon. The earth got better ways. More importantly, Auntie Ruth taught Isabella about African spirits that had survived the crossing, about Erzuli and Dambala and Legba, about the Orishas who walked in new clothes in this strange land but kept their old power. She taught about ancestors who watched from beyond the veil, who accumulated the prayers and pain of their descendants and waited for the right moment to act. Your grandmother, Auntie Ruth said one night, mixing clay and plantain leaves. She was from the Ashanti people, warriors, strong-willed. Before she lost her mind to grief, she taught you things you don't even remember teaching. But your body remembers, your spirit remembers. When you go to that place during the ant bites, that place where you float above the pain, that's her wisdom working in you, passed down through blood and prayer. Isabella listened and learned and practiced. She learned to meditate, to separate her consciousness from her flesh, to endure not by fighting pain but by accepting it as temporary, as something happening to her body, but not to her essential self. This was the wisdom that had kept African people alive through the Middle Passage, through seasoning camps, through centuries of bondage, the knowledge that they could take your body, but not your soul unless you gave it to them. But Auntie Ruth taught darker lessons too. Lessons about vengeance and justice and the difference between mercy and weakness. The masters preach forgiveness, she'd say, voice hard as iron, because forgiveness keeps them safe. They want us to turn the other cheek so they can slap that one too. But the old spirits, the African spirits, they know different. They know that some debts must be paid in blood, that some sins are too heavy for prayer to lift. She taught Isabella about the red clay of Georgia, how it held memory better than any history book, how every drop of black blood spilled on it created a debt the earth itself would collect. She taught about fire ants as agents of the earth's will, small but fierce, capable of bringing down creatures 1,000 times their size through coordination and determination. Them ants you suffer with, Auntie Ruth said, they ain't your enemy. They just doing what ants do, defending their home. But they can be taught, can be guided, can be reminded who the real enemy is. The earth speaks to those who listen, child, and you've been listening for 6 years now. You think them ants don't know you? You think the mound don't recognize the blood you spilled on it? The tears you watered it with? Isabella started to understand that her suffering hadn't been meaningless, hadn't been just random cruelty. It had been an initiation, a brutal education in the powers that lived beneath the surface of things. She'd been forced to commune with the earth and its creatures in the most violent way possible, but communion it was nonetheless. She knew that mound better than Silas Crow knew his own face, knew those ants better than he knew his own black heart. Auntie Ruth also taught her patience of a specific kind. Quick revenge is satisfaction, but patient revenge is art. You could try to poison him, stick a knife between his ribs, but they'd hang you before sunset. That ain't justice, that's waste. Real justice, the kind that echoes, the kind that teaches lessons to everyone watching, that takes time, takes planning, takes waiting for the moment when the earth itself is ready to act. By the time Isabella was 18, she'd become two people, the enslaved woman who worked the fields with her head down and her mouth shut, and the initiate who carried knowledge that terrified even the old root doctors. She'd survived 200 sessions on the ant mound, and emerged not broken but transformed, not defeated but weaponized, not conquered but consecrated to a purpose that hummed in her bones like the old African drums they wasn't allowed to play no more. The ancestors were watching, the earth was waiting, the ants were ready. All that was needed now was the moment, that perfect convergence of opportunity and will, when justice could wear the face of vengeance and no one could say it wasn't earned. Isabella's grandmother had told her stories before grief swallowed the old woman's mind whole. Stories passed down through generations of women who'd survived ships and slavery, stories that carried more than memory, They carried power, carried resistance, carried the accumulated wisdom of African peoples who'd learned to hide their truth in plain sight. The grandmother's name was Abeni, which meant, "We asked for her and she came." She'd been born free in what white folks called the Gold Coast, had lived 16 years breathing African air before Portuguese slavers raided her village and changed everything. The crossing nearly killed her. She watched her mother die of fever in the ship's hold, watched her father throw himself overboard rather than live in chains. But Abeni survived by going somewhere inside herself, a trick she'd later teach her granddaughter. In the old country, Abeni would whisper to young Isabella, speaking in a mixture of English and languages Isabella didn't understand, but somehow felt in her bones. We knew the spirits walked among us. We knew trees had souls, that rivers carried memory, that the earth itself was alive and listening. White folks, they think the land is dead, something to own and use. But we know better. The land chooses its children. Abeni taught Isabella about Anansi the spider, trickster god who survived by cunning rather than strength, who taught that the powerless could defeat the powerful through cleverness and patience. She taught about Mami Wada, the water spirit who could bless or curse depending on how she was approached, who demanded respect but rewarded those who showed proper reverence. She taught about Oya, warrior goddess of wind and transformation, patron of women who had to become fierce to survive. Most importantly, Abeni taught Isabella how to breathe. Not regular breathing, but the deep rhythmic breathing that connected you to ancestors, to the earth, to something larger than your individual suffering. When pain comes, Abeni would say, her hands on young Isabella's chest, breathe through it like the ocean breathes through storms. Pain is temporary, but spirit is forever. Let the pain wash over you like waves, but keep your root deep in something they can't reach. This breathing technique was what saved Isabella on the ant mound, what allowed her to endure what should have destroyed her. When Silas held her down and the ants swarmed, Isabella would remember her grandmother's voice, would find that rhythm that separated body from soul, would go to a place where she could witness her suffering without being consumed by it. But Abeni taught darker wisdoms too, lessons about curses and hexes, about how to mark someone for the spirit's attention, how to call down misfortune on those who'd earned it. Witchcraft is white folks' word for what we call justice, Abeni would say. The spirits don't help the cruel, don't protect the wicked, but they remember debts and they collect. Sometimes it takes years, takes generations, but collection always comes. She taught about the crossroads, that liminal space where the human world and spirit world touched, where deals could be made and power could be borrowed at a price. Never go to the crossroads desperate, Abeni warned. The spirits smell desperation like blood in water. Go prepared, go respectful, go with clear purpose, and never promise what you can't deliver, because the spirits take their payments serious. Abeni also taught about animals as messengers and allies. Crows and owls carried omens. Snakes were sacred, connected to transformation and healing. And ants. Abeni had specific teachings about ants. In the old country, we respected ants. They build kingdoms underground, work together without question, protect their own with fury that don't hesitate. Some tribes believed ants carried the souls of ancestors, that disturbing their mounds was disturbing the dead. This knowledge lived in Isabella even after Abeni's mind broke following Samuel's sale. Even after the old woman stopped recognizing her own granddaughter and wandered the quarters talking to people only she could see. The teachings had been planted deep, watered with African words and ancestral prayer, and they grew in Isabella like roots searching for bedrock. When Isabella lay on the ant mound for the 50th time, the 100th time, the 150th time, she wasn't just enduring, she was communing. She was speaking to the spirits her grandmother had taught her about, was asking for strength from Oya the warrior, was practicing the patience of Anansi the spider. She was becoming something her grandmother had maybe foreseen, a bridge between the suffering of the present and the power of the past. Auntie Ruth recognized this transformation because she'd known Abeni, had learned from the same African elders before the old ways got diluted by time and trauma. Your grandmother prepared you without knowing what for, Ruth told Isabella. She planted seeds of power in you before her mind went wandering. Them seeds been growing in the dark soil of your suffering, and they almost ready to bear fruit. The enslaved community watched Isabella carry this double knowledge, the visible suffering everyone could see, and the invisible power that only those with eyes to see could recognize. She worked the cotton fields like everyone else, picked until her fingers bled, endured the sun and the overseer's curses. But at night she'd slip away to sit by the ant mound, would place her scarred hands on the red clay, would whisper in the languages her grandmother taught her. Some folks thought she'd gone mad like a beanie before her. Others recognized it as a different kind of madness, the holy kind, the kind that came before prophets spoke and kingdoms fell. The old ones remembered stories from Africa about women who bore unbearable suffering and emerged transformed, became vessels for ancestral power, became instruments of change that couldn't be stopped, because they'd already endured the worst that could be done to them. Isabella's grandmother had given her the tools. The aunts had given her the training. Auntie Ruth had given her the knowledge. All that remained was for Isabella herself to decide what kind of justice she would craft from these gifts, what shape her vengeance would take, how she'd write her name in the blood-soaked earth of Georgia in letters large enough that even the masters couldn't pretend not to read them. The ancestors were watching through Isabella's eyes. Africa was remembering through Isabella's pain. And something old and patient and absolutely merciless was preparing to use Isabella's hands to balance scales that had been tipped toward cruelty for far too long. The plantation ground started changing in ways only those with eyes to see could recognize. It was subtle at first, small signs that most folks dismissed as coincidence or imagination, but the old ones knew better. They'd seen this before, back in Africa, back in the old stories. The way the world shifts when something's about to break open, when the spirit realm presses close against the physical one like a hand pushing through fabric. The mockingbirds that used to sing at dawn near the slave quarters stopped their music. They'd sit on fence posts silent, heads cocked, watching the ant mound with black eyes that seemed too intelligent, too focused. Dogs wouldn't go near that section of the field no more, would whine and pull back on their ropes when their masters tried to drag them close. Even Silas Crow's horse, that mean-spirited stallion that had trampled more than one enslaved person without hesitation, would shy and sidestep when passing within 30 feet of Isabella's mound. The ants themselves grew more aggressive, more territorial. Their mound expanded, spreading wider, growing taller, until it stood nearly 5 feet high. Massive for fire ants, almost unnatural. Workers could be seen at all hours carrying out their business with unusual intensity, as if preparing for something, building toward some purpose only they understood. The red clay around the mound darkened, enriched by something more than rain, stained by something that couldn't be washed away. Enslaved folks started noticing other changes too. Tools would go missing from where they'd been left, only to turn up later in strange places. Hose leaning against the ant mound, water buckets overturned near it, as if the earth itself was rearranging things according to some plan humans couldn't fathom. One morning, someone found a perfect circle of dead grass around the mound, nothing growing within 10 feet of it, like the ground had declared that space sacred or cursed or both. Isabella herself had changed in ways that frightened even Auntie Ruth. The young woman who'd been soft-spoken and careful had developed a presence that made people step aside without thinking, that made conversations stop when she walked past. Her eyes, once warm and full of the kind of hope that slavery tries to kill, had gone distant and cold, like she was looking at something beyond the visible world, something the rest of them couldn't see but could feel, pressing down like storm clouds heavy with unshed rain. She moved differently too. Where before she'd walked with the shuffle of the defeated, keeping her head down and her shoulders hunched, now she walked upright, deliberate, each step planted firm like she was measuring the ground, memorizing it, claiming it in some way that had nothing to do with legal ownership. The other enslaved people noticed and whispered about it in the dark privacy of their cabins, wondering what kind of transformation they was witnessing, whether it would bring liberation or destruction, or both tangled together so tight you couldn't separate them. Silas Crow noticed the changes too. though his pride and his whiskey-soaked brain couldn't make proper sense of them. He felt it as a vague unease, an itch between his shoulder blades when he walked past Isabella, a sense that something had shifted in the power dynamic he'd always controlled absolutely. It made him angry, that feeling, because men like Silas only know how to respond to confusion with cruelty. He increased Isabella's punishments, dragged her to the mound more frequently, held her there longer, pressed harder with his boot between her shoulder blades. But the effect had changed. Isabella didn't scream no more, didn't even make sound. She'd go limp under his weight, not from submission, but from some kind of surrender to a larger process, like she was offering herself not to his cruelty, but to something else, something ancient and patient that was using her suffering as fuel for a fire that was building slow, but inevitable. The enslaved community watched this escalation with dread and fascination, mixed together like blood and clay. Some prayed for Isabella's death because they thought it would be mercy, thought her soul had already fled to wherever souls go when the body becomes just a vessel for pain. Others prayed for her survival because they sensed she was becoming something necessary, a living testimony to the fact that you could drag black folks through hell, but you couldn't make them demons. You could only make them dangerous. Auntie Ruth spent more time with Isabella, teaching her things that scared even the old conjure woman to speak aloud. They'd meet in the woods after dark, in clearings where Spanish moss hung like curtains, and the night sounds of frogs and insects provided cover for their whispered conversations. Ruth taught Isabella about blood magic, about how suffering consecrates, how pain can be transformed into power if you know the old words, the old ways, the old bargains. "The spirit's been watching you," Ruth said one night, her voice barely audible over the creek's murmur. "They seen what you endured. They counted every bite, every moment you chose survival over surrender. That kind of suffering creates a debt, child, not on you, but on them that caused it. The earth keeps ledgers more accurate than any master's account book, and payment is coming due." Isabella listened with those cold, distant eyes, nodded slow like she already knew, like Ruth was just confirming what the ants had already whispered to her during those long minutes pressed against their kingdom. She'd stopped being surprised by anything, stopped feeling much of anything except a deep, bone-cold certainty that her purpose was approaching, that all this pain had been preparation for something singular and terrible and absolutely necessary. The field hands started avoiding Isabella not from fear of her, but from fear of being too close when whatever was building finally broke. They recognized the signs from old stories, the way certain slaves in Africa would be chosen by spirits, would endure trials that marked them as vessels for divine retribution, would become instruments of justice that couldn't be bargained with or deterred. Isabella was becoming one of these, a storm in human form, and storms don't care who gets wet when they finally break. Even Master Wexford, distant and unconcerned as he usually was with the details of plantation management, mentioned something to his wife about that strange girl with the ant problem. He'd seen Isabella from his window one evening, standing motionless beside the mound as the sun set, her silhouette black against the red sky, and something about the image unsettled him in a way he couldn't articulate. It looked too much like a monument, like a warning, like something that should be heeded but wouldn't be until too late. The summer of Isabella's 18th year was the hottest anyone could remember. The air hung thick and still, refusing to move as if the world itself was holding its breath. Cotton wilted in the fields despite constant watering. The creek ran low, exposing rocks that hadn't seen sunlight in years. And through it all, the ant mound thrived, grew, expanded, its inhabitants working with fevered intensity, while Isabella watched and learned and waited with the patience of something that had already died and been reborn as pure purpose. The old ones say that before great change comes suffering, and before suffering brings change, there must be a moment when the oppressed and the earth itself reach the same conclusion. Enough. The plantation was approaching that moment. Isabella had reached it. The ants, those ancient architects of underground kingdoms, had been ready for centuries. All that was needed now was the spark, the trigger, the moment when patience transformed into action and waiting became reckoning. And Silas Crow, fool drunk on his own power, his own immunity to consequence, was about to provide that spark without knowing he'd been carrying it all along, burning slow in the dry tinder of his cruelty, waiting for the perfect moment to consume everything he thought he controlled. The day began ordinary, which is how the most extraordinary days often start. No thunder, no omens that white folks could read, just heat and humidity, and the endless work that defined enslaved existence. Isabella rose before dawn like always, splashed tepid water on her face from the wooden bucket, pulled on the same rough cotton dress worn thin from washing and wearing, and walked to the fields with the others in that silent procession that happened every morning except Sundays. But the old ones felt it. Auntie Ruth woke with a pressure behind her eyes, the kind that came before hurricanes or significant deaths. She stood outside her cabin watching the sky lighten from black to gray to pink, and she knew in her bones that this was the day she'd been preparing Isabella for. The day when all those lessons in root work and patience and African wisdom would either bear fruit or prove useless against the weight of white cruelty. The heat came early and stayed. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, the air was already thick enough to chew, heavy with moisture that promised rain but wouldn't deliver. The enslaved people worked the cotton rows in silence, broken only by the overseer's occasional shout, the creak of wicker baskets, the shuffle of bare feet on red clay. Isabella worked steady, mechanical, her hands moving through the motions her body had learned so thoroughly that her mind could wander elsewhere, could review plans, could rehearse movements, could prepare for something she'd been preparing for without knowing she was preparing for 6 long years. Silas Crow was in a mood. Everyone could see it in the way he sat his horse, in the tension of his shoulders, in how his hand kept going to the whip at his belt, like it was a worry stone he needed to touch for comfort. He'd been drinking the night before. They could smell it on him, that sour whiskey stink that meant trouble, and morning drinking always made him meaner, more unpredictable, more likely to find fault where no fault existed just so he'd have excuse to exercise his power. He circled the field like a buzzard, eyes scanning for infractions, for anyone moving too slow or too fast or looking up when they should look down. The enslaved people kept their heads low, their movements careful, trying to be invisible the way prey animals try to blend with grass when predators hunt. But invisibility is a privilege Isabella had lost long ago when Silas decided her silence was challenge, her endurance was defiance, her very survival was insult to his authority. "You?" Silas called, pointing at Isabella with his riding crop. "Come here." His voice was thick, words slightly slurred. He'd been drinking already this morning, probably started before breakfast, which meant his judgment was impaired and his cruelty was amplified, and his sense of his own invincibility was at its most dangerous peak. Isabella straightened, set down her basket, and walked toward him with that steady, deliberate pace she'd developed, each step measured and firm. The other field hands watched from corners of their eyes, not daring to turn their heads fully, but needing to witness, needing to be able to testify later if testimony was required. The air felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes when every hair on your body stands at attention, warning of electricity building nearby. "You've been looking at me wrong," Silas said when Isabella stopped in front of his horse. It wasn't true. Isabella hadn't looked at him at all. But truth never mattered when power wanted excuse for violence. "You've been moving too slow, working too lazy. Seems like you need another lesson." He smiled when he said it, that same smile he'd worn 200 times before, that smile that said he enjoyed this, that whatever he was about to do brought him pleasure deeper than anything else in his miserable life could provide. Isabella didn't respond. Didn't plead, didn't apologize, didn't show fear. She just stood there looking at something past his shoulder, through him, beyond him, her face calm as still water. And that's what pushed Silas over the edge he'd been teetering on, that unnatural calm, that refusal to give him the fear he craved like other men craved food or sex or sleep. "The mound," he said, jerking his thumb toward it. "Now." He dismounted with the careful movements of a drunk trying to appear sober, his boots hitting the ground harder than necessary, his balance slightly off. The horse snorted and sidled, nostrils flaring, and Silas jerked hard on the reins, cursing the animal for cowardice. The walk to the ant mound felt longer than it was, stretched by tension and heat and the weight of something approaching that couldn't be named, but could be felt by everyone present. Isabella walked ahead, Silas behind her with his hand on her shoulder, pushing her forward, and behind them the other enslaved people had stopped working entirely, standing frozen in tableau watching this ritual they'd witnessed so many times before. But that felt different now, charged with electricity that made the air taste metallic. When they reached the mound, Silas shoved Isabella toward it, but she didn't stumble. She turned to face him instead, standing between him and the ants. And for the first time in 6 years of torment, she looked directly into his eyes. Really looked, with full attention, with something burning behind her gaze that made Silas take a half-step back before his pride caught him and stopped the retreat. "Down," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Get down on that mound like I taught you." He moved closer, reaching to push her, and that's when his horse reared. The stallion, that mean beast that had never showed fear of anything, suddenly screamed, an awful, terrified sound, and reared back so hard it jerked the reins from Silas's hand. The horse wheeled and bolted, leaving Silas standing there cursed and confused and suddenly aware that something had changed, that the pattern he'd established and repeated was breaking in ways he didn't understand. "Damn beast," Silas muttered, turning back to Isabella, and that's when he made his final mistake. He stepped too close to the mound itself, his boot crushing part of the structure, his weight pressing down on tunnels that had been preparing, waiting, serving as home to millions of inhabitants who'd learned over 6 years to recognize the scent, the taste, the very presence of the man who'd weaponized their home against one of their own. Isabella saw it before Silas did, the way the ground shifted slightly, the way the ants came boiling out not in the random swarming they usually showed, but in directed, purposeful waves, moving towards Silas with the coordination of an army executing a long-rehearsed battle plan. She saw and she understood that this was the moment, that everything had aligned exactly as it needed to, that the earth itself was offering her this opportunity, and all she had to do was accept it. So when Silas grabbed her arm to force her down onto the mound, Isabella didn't resist. She went with his pull, used his own momentum, stepped aside at the last second and let his forward motion carry him past her, off balance, stumbling, falling toward the mound he'd made into her torture chamber 200 times. Time slowed the way it does in moments of great violence or revelation, each second stretching elastic and strange. Silas Crow fell toward the ant mound in slow motion, his arms windmilling, his face transforming from cruelty to confusion to the beginning of fear. His boot caught on a root exposed by erosion, his body weight pitched forward, and Isabella, who'd learned the terrain better than she knew her own face, who'd studied every inch of this ground with the focus of someone preparing for exactly this moment, stepped aside with practiced grace. Silas hit the mound hard, his full weight coming down on the structure he'd used as a weapon for 6 years. The impact was significant enough to collapse several tunnels, to crush entrance chambers, to send vibrations through the entire colony that translated immediately into alarm, defense, attack. And the ants responded not with the usual defensive swarming, but with something that looked almost like recognition, like they'd been waiting for this, planning for this, preparing for this moment, when they could repay every violation of their home. They came fast. Lord have mercy, they came fast. Thousands of them, tens of thousands pouring out of broken tunnels and crushed chambers, swarming over Silas's legs, his arms, his torso, finding every gap in clothing, every patch of exposed skin, every vulnerable place where their mandibles could grip and their stingers could inject venom that burned like liquid fire. Silas tried to rise, tried to brush them off, but the ants were too many, too fast, too coordinated. They covered him like a living blanket, red and seething and absolutely merciless. Silas started screaming. The sound was terrible, inhuman, the kind of scream that comes from pain beyond endurance, pain that unmakes a person from the inside out. He rolled, thrashed, clawed at his own skin trying to remove the ants. But for everyone he crushed, 20 more took its place. They were in his hair, his ears, crawling across his face toward his eyes and mouth. They were under his shirt, his pants, finding the soft, vulnerable skin that had never known suffering, that had been protected and pampered while he dealt suffering to others. Isabella stood watching. She didn't move to help, didn't call for assistance, didn't show any emotion at all on her face. She just stood there with her arms at her sides, watching with those cold, distant eyes as the man who'd tortured her 200 times learned what that torture felt like. The other enslaved people had run closer when they heard the screaming, were standing in a rough circle around the scene, and they too stood frozen, witnessing something that felt like divine intervention, like cosmic justice, like all the prayers they'd whispered in darkness were being answered in red clay and chitin. Silas managed to get to his knees, his face already swelling from multiple stings, his eyes wild with pain and terror. "Help me," he gasped, looking at the enslaved people surrounding him, expecting them to rush to his aid because that's what they'd always done. Obeyed, served, helped, even when helping went against their own interests. But nobody moved. They stood like statues, like witnesses at a trial, watching judgment being delivered by creatures too small to fear white men's laws or guns or whips. "Isabella," Silas choked out, his hand reaching toward her, fingers grasping at air. "Please." That single word carried more weight than any apology could, carried the recognition that in this moment, all his power had evaporated, that the hierarchy he'd enforced with whips and boots and casual cruelty had inverted completely, that he was now the one begging, and she was the one deciding whether mercy would be shown. Isabella looked at him, really looked at him for the first time as an equal, as someone whose fate was in her hands, the way hers had been in his. She saw him clearly, not as an omnipotent overseer, but as a small, cruel man who'd used what little power he had to destroy others because he had nothing else to make himself feel significant. She saw him drowning in ants the way she'd drowned in them 200 times, saw him learning the lesson he'd taught so enthusiastically, and she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, not even hate anymore. Just a cold, factual observation that debts come due, and pain teaches everyone eventually. She knelt down slowly, her face close to his, close enough that he could see himself reflected in her dark eyes. "You taught me about suffering," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear despite the screaming. "You taught me that some lessons take time to learn. You taught me that pain is the best teacher. You taught me patience." She paused, watching another wave of ants flow over his shoulder toward his neck. "And now, I'm teaching you what I learned." Then Isabella did something that would be whispered about in slave quarters across Georgia for generations. She reached out, not to help him, but to push him. One firm push on his chest, using the same motion he'd used on her 200 times, and Silas Crow fell backward fully onto the mound, his body weight crushing more tunnels, sending more alarm pheromones through the colony, triggering an even more massive response from the ants. The hole opened beneath him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually as the tunnels collapsed under his weight, as the structure that had seemed solid revealed itself to be honeycomb, weakened by Isabella's knowledge of exactly where to push, exactly how much force to apply, exactly which section of the mound was most vulnerable. Silas began sinking into the red clay, into the chambers where queens laid eggs and workers stored food, and soldiers trained for battle, into the very heart of the kingdom he'd violated so many times. His screaming reached a pitch that didn't sound human anymore, a sound of pure animal terror as he realized what was happening, as he understood that this wasn't just punishment, but burial, that Isabella intended to do to him what he'd threatened so many times, to put him in the ground and let the earth have him. He tried to climb out, but the walls collapsed. The ants covered every surface, and his own thrashing only made him sink faster, deeper, into the red Georgia clay that had been waiting patient and hungry for exactly this offering. Isabella stood at the edge watching him sink. Behind her, the enslaved people watched too, their faces showing emotions that ranged from horror to satisfaction to something like religious awe. This was justice outside the law, punishment outside the courts, vengeance served by the earth itself with Isabella as its instrument. Nobody tried to stop it. Nobody called for help. They all understood that this moment had been 6 years in the making, that every bite Isabella endured had been down payment on this reckoning, that debts this heavy couldn't be settled with words or forgiveness or anything less than blood and earth and complete accounting. Silas's hand reached up one last time, fingers grasping empty air, his mouth open in a scream that was already weakening, already losing force as venom accumulated in his bloodstream and his body went into shock. Isabella looked at that reaching hand, remembered her own hands reaching for mercy that never came, reaching for her mother during those first times on the mound, reaching for anything that might save her from the suffering he dealt so casually. She didn't take his hand. She watched it fall, watched him sink deeper, watched the red clay close over him inch by inch while the ants swarmed and bit and stung until his movements slowed, stopped, and finally ceased entirely. The mound swallowed Silas Crow the way the Atlantic had swallowed enslaved people who threw themselves overboard, the way the earth had swallowed countless black bodies worked to death in these fields. But this time, the swallowing felt like digestion, like the earth was consuming something toxic and transforming it into fertilizer for whatever would grow next. When it was finished, when the clay had settled and the ants had calmed and Silas Crow existed only as a memory and a shape beneath the surface, Isabella stood and turned to face the assembled enslaved people. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't say anything at all. She just looked at each of them in turn, her eyes carrying a message that didn't need words. This is what patience looks like. This is what suffering can birth. This is what happens when you push someone too far, and the earth itself decides enough is enough. Then Isabella walked back to the cotton field, picked up her basket, and resumed picking like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just shifted on its axis, like justice hadn't just been served by fire ants and red clay, and one woman who'd learned that survival sometimes means becoming the thing you fear most, absolutely merciless when mercy would mean letting evil continue unpunished. The old ones would later say this was the day the plantation changed, the day fear switched sides, the day the enslaved people of Wexford understood that even in chains, even in bondage, even in the deepest hell of slavery, the human spirit could still find ways to fight back, to balance scales, to make oppressors pay for oppression. This was the day Isabella of the Ants became legend, became warning, became proof that suffering can become power if you're patient enough, fierce enough, and willing enough to let the earth itself be your ally in the eternal fight for justice. And Silas Crow learned his final lesson buried in red Georgia clay, taught by creatures so small, he'd never bothered to fear them, delivered by a woman he'd broken 200 times without understanding that breaking can also be forging, that what doesn't kill you might just make you absolutely deadly. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound could have been. It pressed down on the cotton field like a physical weight, like the atmosphere itself had changed composition, and now carried something thick and choking that made breathing feel like work. The enslaved people stood frozen in their positions, baskets half filled, hands still reaching toward cotton bowls they'd forgotten they were picking, eyes fixed on the mound where Silas Crow had disappeared into red clay and crawling vengeance. Nobody spoke. Speaking would have required acknowledging what they'd witnessed, putting words to something that felt too large, too terrible, too necessary to be contained by language. They'd seen death before. Lord knows they'd seen plenty of death, had watched children sold away never to return, had seen old folks worked literally to death in these same fields, had witnessed hangings and whippings and brutality that should have destroyed their faith in any kind of divine justice. But this was different. This wasn't death dealt by white hands according to white laws in service of white comfort. This was the earth itself rising up, using one of their own as instrument, delivering judgment that felt biblical in its completeness. Isabella stood with her back to them all, her hands moving mechanically through the cotton, her fingers finding bowls and pulling with the same steady rhythm she'd maintained for years. She didn't look back at the mound, didn't check to see if Silas might somehow resurface, didn't show any emotion on her face beyond the blank, careful neutrality that enslaved people wore like armor against a world that punished feeling. But everyone watching her could sense something had changed in her. Something had settled or released or transformed in that moment when she'd pushed Silas Crow into his grave and watched the earth accept the offering. Slowly, tentatively, the other field hands began moving again. Hands returned to picking, feet shuffled between rows. The work resumed because work always resumed, because stopping meant questions, and questions meant attention from the big house, and attention meant danger for everyone. But the quality of their movements had changed. There was a carefulness now, a precision, as if they were moving through a world where the old rules had been suspended and nobody yet understood what new rules might replace them. Old Job, who'd been enslaved on Wexford Plantation longer than anyone could remember, who'd survived 3 different masters and countless overseers, who carried wisdom in his bent spine and scarred back, was the first to approach Isabella. He moved slow, respectful, coming alongside her in the cotton row and working in silence for several minutes before speaking. "Child," he said finally, his voice pitched low so only she could hear, "what you done today gonna echo, gonna ripple out like a stone thrown in still water. You understand that?" It wasn't accusation or praise, just statement of fact delivered by someone who'd seen enough to know that actions have consequences that spread far beyond their immediate moment. Isabella didn't stop picking. "I understand," she said, her voice flat and distant. "I understood when he pushed me on that mound the first time. I understood at 50 times, at 100 times, at 200 times. This been coming for 6 years, and every person on this plantation knew it. The only one who didn't know was him, and that's because evil don't recognize itself in mirrors." Old Job nodded slowly, his gnarled fingers moving through cotton with practiced efficiency. "White folks gonna come asking questions. Master Wexford, the patty rollers, maybe even Law from town. They gonna want to know what happened to their overseer, where he went, why nobody stopped what happened." "Then they can ask the earth," Isabella replied. "They can dig up that mound and see what answers they find. I ain't got nothing to tell them they don't already know deep in their bones, that you can't plant cruelty season after season and expect to harvest anything but vengeance. That debt accumulates and eventually comes due, that the ground remembers even when people forget." By midday, the absence of Silas Crow had been noticed. His horse had wandered back to the stable riderless, still spooked and wild-eyed, refusing to be caught. Master Wexford sent his house servants to inquire, then came himself when their reports made no sense, talking about how the field hands was working in unusual silence, how nobody seemed to know where the overseer had gone, how there was something wrong in the atmosphere that couldn't quite be named, but could definitely be felt. When Master Wexford reached the cotton field, riding his own horse with 2 house servants following on foot, the enslaved people immediately stopped working and adopted the postures of submission they'd perfected over years of survival. Heads down, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on ground, bodies radiating the careful nothingness that might protect them from white anger or white suspicion or white violence. "Where's Crow?" Wexford demanded, his voice carrying across the field. He was a thin man, soft from comfortable living, with watery blue eyes that had never looked directly at suffering long enough to really see it. "Someone tell me where my overseer is." Silence answered him, the kind of silence that's not absence of sound but presence of something too heavy to speak. The enslaved people stood like statues, offering nothing, their faces carefully blank, their bodies still as death itself. Wexford's eyes scanned the field, landing finally on Isabella because something about her stillness was different from the others, more deliberate, more centered. "You," he said, pointing at her with his riding crop. "You're that girl Crow was always disciplining. Where is he? When did you see him last?" Isabella raised her head slowly, meeting Wexford's eyes with a directness that made him uncomfortable, that violated some unspoken rule about where black eyes were supposed to look when white men asked questions. "He went to the mound," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The ant mound over there. He went to teach me another lesson about suffering, But the earth had other lessons to teach him. Wexford frowned, not understanding, not wanting to understand. "What are you talking about, girl? Speak plainly." But even as he said it, his horse was becoming agitated, nostrils flaring, hooves dancing nervously, responding to something its rider couldn't sense but that all the animals could feel. The wrongness in the air, the sense that boundaries had been crossed and natural order had been disrupted in ways that couldn't be uncrossed. "The mound," Isabella repeated, pointing. "That's where you'll find him. That's where the earth took payment for 6 years of debt. That's where justice got served by creatures too small for laws to notice and too patient for evil to escape." Wexford rode toward the ant mound, the house servants following reluctantly, and what they found there sent one of them running back toward the big house, while the other stood frozen, unable to process what his eyes were showing him. The mound itself was larger than it had been, swollen with activity, its surface crawling with thousands of ants moving in patterns that looked almost purposeful, almost organized, almost aware, and at its base, barely visible beneath red clay and insect activity, was the edge of a boot, the corner of a shirt, fragments of evidence that something human had been consumed by something decidedly not. Master Wexford sat on his horse staring at the mound for a long time, his face going through expressions that started with confusion, moved through disbelief, and settled finally on a kind of queasy understanding that he'd never be able to speak aloud in white company, but that he understood nonetheless in his bones. His overseer had disappeared into the earth, swallowed by the same ground that had swallowed so much black blood and black pain over the years. And somehow, impossibly, the ground had decided to even the scales just slightly, to take one white life in payment for the countless black lives it had witnessed being destroyed. He didn't order the mound dug up, didn't call for investigation or inquest or any of the official procedures that should have followed the death of a white man on plantation ground. Because opening that mound would mean acknowledging what had happened, putting official recognition on something that was better left unspoken, admitting that his authority, his control, his entire system of power had been revealed as temporary and conditional, and ultimately subject to forces that didn't respect property deeds or skin color or legal ownership of human souls. Instead, Wexford turned his horse and rode back toward the big house, leaving the mound undisturbed, leaving Silas Crow buried in red clay and divine justice. The message was clear to everyone who witnessed his retreat. Some things are better left alone, some questions are better left unasked, some debts are better acknowledged through silence than through speech that might reveal how fragile white supremacy really was when confronted by the patient, implacable fury of the oppressed, and the earth itself rising to their defense. The enslaved people returned to their work, and the afternoon passed in that same heavy silence, broken only by the sounds of cotton being picked and baskets being filled, and the steady rhythm of labor that continued regardless of death or justice or cosmic realignment. But everyone working those fields knew something had shifted permanently. That fear had changed sides, even if only slightly. That the myth of white invincibility had been cracked, if not shattered. And that Isabella of the Ants had become something more than a woman. She'd become a story, a warning, a promise that suffering doesn't last forever, and debts eventually come due. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red that matched the Georgia clay, Isabella finally allowed herself to look back at the mound. The ants had settled, their frenzied activity calming now that the threat had been neutralized and their kingdom had been avenged. The mound stood taller than before, more solid, as if Silas Crow's body had been incorporated into its structure, had become part of its foundation, had been transformed from oppressor into building material for something that would outlast any memory of who he'd been or what cruelty he'd represented. And Isabella felt something she hadn't felt in 6 years, the faint, tentative stirring of something that might eventually, possibly, become peace. Not happiness. Happiness was too light, too superficial for what she'd endured and what she'd done. But peace, that heavy, hard-won peace that comes from knowing that at least one debt has been paid, that at least one oppressor has faced consequences, that at least one small corner of an unjust world has been forcibly adjusted towards something resembling justice. The old ones would say later that this was the day Wefford Plantation began its slow decline, that some essential foundation had been removed when Silas Crow disappeared into the earth, that without his particular brand of cruelty, maintaining order through terror, the whole system began showing cracks that would eventually bring the entire structure down. But that's later story, future history. In this moment, in this day's ending light, what mattered was simpler and more immediate. One woman had survived the unsurvivable, had transformed suffering into power, had taught the earth itself to be her ally, and had reminded everyone who witnessed it that no evil is eternal and no debt is too patient to eventually be collected. The days following Silas Crow's disappearance moved strange and slow, like the plantation itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what consequences would flow from that moment when earth and ants and accumulated suffering had conspired to rebalance scales that had been weighted toward cruelty for generations. Master Wexford brought in a new overseer within a week, a younger man named Patterson from Virginia, less brutal than Crow, but no less committed to the system of bondage that sustained white comfort at the expense of black humanity. But Patterson was afraid. Everyone could see it in the way he avoided looking directly at Isabella, in how he gave the ant mound a wide berth when walking the fields, in the carefulness of his commands and the hesitation before he raised his voice or hand in anger. The story had spread, carried by house servants to other plantations, whispered among enslaved people gathering at the creek to wash clothes or meeting secretly in the woods for prayer meetings. The story grew with each telling accumulated details and embellishments and significance that transformed it from simple event into parable, into warning, into promise. They called her Isabella of the Ants now, saying her name with respect that bordered on reverence, as if she'd become something more than human through her ordeal and her vengeance. Mothers told their children about her to teach them that suffering could be survived, that patience was a weapon, that the ground itself might rise up to defend those who'd been pushed too far. Old folks included her in prayers alongside Moses and Harriet Tubman, alongside names from scripture and African legend, placing her in that pantheon of resistors who'd found ways to fight back against impossible odds and improbable enemies. Isabella herself seemed unchanged by the attention, by the transformation from victim to legend. She worked the fields like always, picked cotton with the same steady rhythm, spoke little, and showed less emotion. But those who knew her best, who'd watched her transformation across 6 years of torture, could see subtle differences. She walked with her head higher now, moved through space like someone who'd claimed it, rather than someone merely occupying it by permission. Her eyes, when she looked at white folks, didn't automatically drop to the ground anymore. She held their gaze just long enough to make them uncomfortable, just long enough to remind them that she'd done something they couldn't punish because punishing it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledgement would reveal truths about power and vulnerability that white supremacy couldn't afford to speak aloud. The ant mound itself became taboo ground. Nobody went near it except Isabella, who'd visit sometimes in evenings cooling, would stand beside it speaking softly in languages, African words mixed with English, prayers mixed with conversation, addressing ancestors and earth spirits, and the ants themselves as if they were congregation gathered to hear witness testimony. The mound continued to thrive, grew even larger over the months that followed, became home to what must have been millions of ants who'd taken Silas Crow's body and transformed it into something useful, something generative, breaking down his flesh and bones and distributing them through their kingdom as food and building material and fertilizer for whatever small plants grew on the mound's surface. Auntie Ruth said it was fitting, said it was what should happen to all evil, consumed by small things working together, broken down into components that could be repurposed toward life instead of death, transformed from oppressor into unwilling nourishment for the community he'd terrorized. "The earth knows how to compose," Ruth would say, her old voice carrying wisdom accumulated across decades of surviving slavery and observing justice delivered through patience. "It takes the worst of us and makes it useful, takes death and makes it feed life. That's resurrection of a kind, though not the kind white folks preach about in their churches." Master Wexford never spoke publicly about what happened to Silas Crow, never filed official reports or called for investigation by authorities in town. The official story, such as it was, suggested that Crow had simply left, had abandoned his position and headed west or north or somewhere else entirely, following opportunities or running from debts or any of the 100 reasons white men might disappear from plantation work. Everyone knew it was lie, but lies that protect social order are more valuable than truths that threaten it, so the lie was maintained through collective silence that said more about power's fragility than any admission could have. But the enslaved community knew truth, carried it in their bones and their songs and their stories. They knew that the ground beneath their feet was not neutral territory, but contested space, that it held memory of every drop of blood spilled on it and accumulated debts that someday, somehow, would be collected. They knew that Isabella had accessed power that came not from strength or weapons, but from patience and suffering, and willingness to let the earth itself be her ally in a fight that couldn't be won through conventional resistance. The cotton harvest that year was smaller than usual, productivity down across Wexford Plantation, in ways that couldn't be easily explained or corrected. The enslaved people worked, but slower now, more deliberately, with less fear of consequences because consequences had become unpredictable, because the old certainties about who held power and who must submit had been complicated by Isabella's story. Small acts of resistance proliferated, tools that went missing, work that took longer than it should, mistakes that happened too frequently to be accidental. Nothing dramatic enough to warrant severe punishment, but accumulating into friction that made the plantation machine run less smoothly. That demonstrated in small ways that absolute power was illusion maintained only through constant terror. And terror had been demonstrated to have limits, to be vulnerable to patient counterforce. Master Wexford grew thin and nervous, drank more, spent less time managing plantation business and more time in his study with account books that showed declining profits and mounting debts. His wife complained about the atmosphere, said there was something wrong with the air on the plantation, something that made her sleep poorly and dream badly. She wanted to move back to Charleston or Savannah, back to city life where enslaved people were house servants rather than field hands, where distance from the means of production allowed more comfortable ignorance about the violence that sustained their comfort. Isabella watched these changes with those cold, patient eyes that had learned to see patterns invisible to others. She understood that what she'd done wasn't revolution. The system of slavery still stood, still functioned, still crushed black lives and dreams with systematic efficiency. But she'd created a crack in the edifice, had demonstrated that even within total oppression, there existed spaces for resistance, moments when the oppressed could strike back and the earth itself would aid their rebellion. Other plantations started hearing stories, started experiencing their own small uprisings, their own acts of resistance that ranged from work slowdowns to poisoned wells to mysterious fires that consumed cotton ready for harvest. The stories always referenced Isabella of the Ants, made her into symbol and inspiration, proof that white power wasn't omnipotent, that suffering could be transformed into power if the sufferer was patient enough, brave enough, connected enough to forces older than slavery, and more patient than any human timeline. And always, in every version of the story told in slave quarters across Georgia, and spreading outward to Carolina, to Virginia, to Louisiana, to everywhere the slave system existed, the central lesson remained constant. The earth itself was witness to their suffering. The ground beneath their feet accumulated their blood, and their tears and their prayers, and someday, somehow, when the accumulated debt became too heavy to bear, the earth would rise up and demand payment from those who'd spilled. So much black blood on red clay for white profit. Isabella became counselor to younger enslaved people, especially young women who'd suffered at overseers' hands or in masters' beds, who carried trauma that threatened to destroy them if they couldn't find meaning in their survival. She taught them what Auntie Ruth had taught her, what the ants had taught her, what 6 years of torture had forced her to learn. That endurance is resistance, that survival is victory, that remembering is revenge of a kind because memory outlasts individual lives and carries testimony forward into futures where perhaps, possibly, Justice might finally be served on scales larger than individual plantations or personal vendettas. "Don't let them make you forget," Isabella would tell these younger women, her voice low but firm, carrying authority earned through suffering. "Don't let the pain make you numb. Don't let the cruelty make you cruel. Remember everything, every blow, every insult, every violation. Write it in your bones, carve it in your heart, because testimony is power, witnessing is resistance, and memory is the weapon they can't take from us no matter how thoroughly they control our bodies." The seasons turned. Summer gave way to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring again. The ant mound stood as monument and warning, grew larger with each passing month, became landmark that travelers used for navigation. "Turn left at Isabella's mound," they'd say, giving it possessive that acknowledged her connection to it, her transformation of it from place of torture into place of justice, from site of her oppression into site of her victory. And through all seasons, through all weather, Isabella maintained her vigil. She worked the fields, survived another year of slavery, endured because endurance was what she'd learned best. But something in her had changed permanently, some essential understanding about power and patience and the long game of resistance that enslaved people had been playing for centuries in ways large and small, visible and invisible, loud and silent. She'd learned that victory doesn't always look like freedom, that sometimes victory looks like surviving another day, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to die, refuse to break, refuse to give your oppressor the satisfaction of your complete destruction. The old ones say that every revolution starts with single acts of refusal, with individuals deciding that enough is enough and risking everything on that decision. Isabella's refusal looked like patience, looked like endurance, looked like letting the earth itself be her army and tiny insects be her soldiers. But refusal it was nonetheless, and its echoes would spread farther than anyone watching that day could have imagined, would inspire resistance in forms both practical and spiritual, would become part of the stories that enslaved people told themselves to stay human in a system designed to reduce them to animals, to stay hopeful in conditions designed to create despair. And Silas Crow, buried in red Georgia clay beneath an ant mound that thrived on his decomposition, became fertilizer for a different kind of growth, the slow, patient, inevitable growth of resistance that would eventually, though not in Isabella's lifetime, break the chains that bound 4 million people in bondage. His cruelty became seed for the destruction of the system he'd enforced. His death became lesson that power built on terror is ultimately fragile. His burial became promise that the earth itself takes sides, and sometimes, just sometimes, it chooses justice over the comfort of oppressors. Years passed, and Isabella grew older the way enslaved people grew older, faster than their actual age, worn down by labor and trauma, and the daily grind of surviving a system designed to break them. Her hair showed gray by her mid-20s, her hands grew gnarled from constant work, her back developed the slight bend that came from years spent picking cotton under unrelenting sun. But her eyes never lost that cold, distant quality they'd developed during her ordeal, that look of someone who'd seen past the veil of everyday reality into something deeper and darker and more truthful than comfortable illusions could accommodate. The plantation changed around her. Master Wexford died in 1857, his heart giving out one humid August night, and his son inherited Wexford Plantation along with its debts and its declining productivity and its atmosphere of barely suppressed resistance that had been growing ever since Silas Crow disappeared into the ant mound. The son tried bringing in new overseers, implementing new systems of control, but nothing worked like it should have. The enslaved people had learned something from Isabella's story, had internalized a lesson about patience and collective power, and the ways that even total oppression contains spaces for resistance. Auntie Ruth died in her sleep in 1859, passing peacefully in a way that enslaved people rarely got to pass, surrounded by the community she'd served as healer and spiritual advisor for decades. Isabella sat with the body all night before burial, kept vigil the way African tradition demanded, whispering prayers in languages she'd learned from Ruth, from her grandmother, from the accumulation of oral tradition that had survived Middle Passage and slavery and systematic attempts to destroy African identity and replace it with nothing but bondage and Christian submission. "You taught me everything that mattered," Isabella said to Ruth's still form. "You taught me that suffering can be seed for power, that patience is weapon, that the earth itself remembers and eventually avenges. You taught me that we're not alone even when we're surrounded by enemies, that ancestors watch and wait and sometimes act through us when the moment is right. I'll carry your teachings forward, pass them to the next generation, make sure that what you knew doesn't die with your body but lives on in the stories we tell and the resistance we practice." The ant mound became shrine of sorts, place where enslaved people would go to pray or make offerings, or simply stand in silent communion with something that represented justice delivered outside white law, vengeance served without white permission, power accessed through means that slavery's architects had never anticipated and couldn't control. They'd leave small tokens, flowers picked from roadside, bits of food saved from their own meager rations, locks of hair or scraps of fabric representing people who'd died or been sold away, asking Isabella's mound to remember them, to hold their memory the way it held Silas Crow's body, to testify on their behalf to whatever powers listened when enslaved people prayed. Isabella became elder before her time, became the one younger people came to for advice and wisdom and perspective on how to survive horror without losing humanity. She taught them what she'd learned through suffering, that you could endure anything if you remembered that endurance itself was victory, that survival was resistance, that maintaining your sense of self in a system designed to destroy it was the most powerful rebellion possible, even when it looked like submission. "They can take your freedom," she'd tell young people newly arrived on the plantation or newly broken by its cruelties. "They can take your family, your home, your language, your name. They can mark your body with scars and bend your back with labor and try to break your spirit with humiliation and pain. But there's something they can't take unless you give it to them. Your knowledge of yourself as human, your connection to ancestors, your membership in a people who've survived worse than this and will survive this too. Hold on to that. Hide it if you must, but don't lose it. Because when freedom comes, and it will come, maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually, those who've maintained their humanity will be ready to walk through the door, while those who've let slavery make them into what slavery says they are will have to learn how to be human all over again. The Civil War came in 1861. Though news of it reached Wexford Plantation slowly, filtered through white anxiety and black hope and the fog of warfare that seemed distant at first, but grew closer with each passing month. Young Master Wexford left to fight for the Confederacy, leaving the plantation in hands of an elderly uncle who had neither energy nor inclination for the brutal control that keeping enslaved people in bondage required. Discipline loosened. The system began showing cracks wider than the small fissures Isabella's act had opened years before. Enslaved people began disappearing from Wexford Plantation, following rumors of Union lines that were supposedly advancing through Georgia, seeking freedom that suddenly seemed possible after lifetimes of impossibility. Isabella watched them go with something like satisfaction, though she herself didn't leave. Not yet. She felt rooted to this place by the same forces that had rooted the ant mound, by the same red clay that had drunk so much black blood and sweat and tears. Her vengeance had been personal, but it had also been geographical, place-specific, tied to this particular ground where her suffering had been measured in bites and years, and accumulated debt that could only be paid here, in this soil, on this land. When Union soldiers finally reached Wexford Plantation in 1865, bringing with them proclamations of emancipation and promises of freedom, Isabella was among the last to leave. She stood beside the ant mound on her final morning as enslaved person, her hand resting on its red clay surface, feeling the vibration of millions of ants going about their business underground, building and feeding and defending their kingdom with the same patience and coordination that had served them so well when called upon to deliver justice 6 years prior. "Thank you," she whispered to the mound, to the ants, to the earth itself. Thank you for teaching me survival. Thank you for teaching me patience. Thank you for being my ally when I had no other. Thank you for showing me that even the smallest, most overlooked creatures can bring down giants if they work together with single-minded purpose. I'll carry these lessons forward into whatever freedom means, whatever life looks like on the other side of these chains. The ants didn't respond. They were just insects after all, following chemical signals and instinct, building their kingdom one grain of sand at a time, without understanding the larger significance humans had imposed on their actions. But Isabella felt something nonetheless, some acknowledgement that maybe she wasn't entirely imagining, some sense that the earth itself had witnessed her testimony and approved of her survival, and marked her as someone who'd earned passage from bondage into whatever came next through suffering, transformed into strength. She walked away from Wexford Plantation with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge in her bones. Knowledge about patience, about survival, about how to endure the unendurable, and come out the other side not unscathed but unbroken, scarred but not destroyed, changed but not defeated. She walked into a world that was nominally free but still hostile, that had ended slavery but not racism, that had broken chains but not the economic and social structures that had made those chains profitable for white people and devastating for black ones. But she walked with her head high, with her back straight despite years of bending over cotton plants, with her eyes focused on horizon rather than ground. She'd survived the unsurvivable, had witnessed the impossible, had participated in justice that existed outside law and morality, that operated beyond white Christian concepts of forgiveness and turning the other cheek. She'd learned that the universe, despite all evidence to contrary, despite all the horror and cruelty and systematic oppression, occasionally tipped toward balance, occasionally served justice to those patient enough to wait for it, occasionally allowed the ground itself to rise up and demand payment from those who'd spilled too much innocent blood on its surface. Isabella of the Ants walked into freedom carrying her story, and everywhere she went in the years that followed, she told it. Told it to freed people trying to figure out how to build lives from the wreckage of slavery. Told it to children who needed to understand their history, to know that their ancestors had been more than victims, had been resistors and survivors, and occasionally, when circumstances aligned just right, victors in small battles against oppression that would take lifetimes and generations to fully overcome. She told her story to journalists who came south to document Reconstruction, to Northern abolitionists who wanted to understand the reality of slavery beyond political abstractions, to anyone who would listen and understand that freedom wasn't gift bestowed by Lincoln or won entirely by Union armies, but was also taken, claimed, seized in moments large and small by enslaved people who refused to let their oppression be complete, who found ways to fight back, even when fighting back seemed impossible. And always, always, she ended her story the same way, with words that became her signature, her testimony, her gift to future generations who would need to know that their ancestors had been fierce and patient and ultimately undefeatable, no matter how thoroughly they'd been defeated in individual moments. Listen close now, because this is important. They took everything from us: our freedom, our families, our names, our languages, our homelands. They marked our bodies with whips and brands and chains. They tried to break our spirits with cruelty so systematic and thorough that it should have destroyed us completely. But they couldn't take our patience, couldn't take our memory, couldn't take our connection to earth and ancestors and each other. And in the end, that's what saved us. Not armies, not laws, not white benevolence, but our own refusal to die, our own determination to survive, our own patience to wait for the moment when we could act and the earth itself would rise to our defense. She lived to be 73 years old, died in her own bed surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried her story forward into the 20th century, where it would inspire civil rights workers and freedom fighters and resistors of all kinds who needed to know that their struggles had precedent, had ancestry, had roots that went deep into red Georgia clay, where Isabella of the Ants had learned that even in the deepest bondage, even in the most complete oppression, the human spirit could still find ways to fight, to resist, to occasionally triumph against enemies who seemed invincible right up until the moment the earth itself decided enough was enough and swallowed them whole. The ant mound stood for decades after Isabella left Wexford Plantation, grew to massive size, became legendary among local black communities who maintained its memory and its significance long after the plantation itself had crumbled into ruins. People would come to see it, to touch the red clay, to remember the story of the woman who'd survived 200 torments and transformed her suffering into power that brought down her oppressor in the most fitting way imaginable, buried alive in the instrument of her torture, consumed by the creatures he'd weaponized against her, the earth itself serving as judge, jury, and executioner. Eventually, time and weather wore the mound down, scattered it, returned it to the earth it had risen from. But the story lived on, passed down through generations in the way that important stories always are, refined and embellished, and kept vital by communities who needed to remember that their ancestors had been more than victims, had been warriors of a different kind, had been survivors whose survival itself was victory against a system designed to destroy them utterly. And somewhere in the ground of that old plantation, now overgrown with kudzu and pine trees, somewhere beneath the red Georgia clay, Silas Crow's bones lie mingled with ant tunnels and tree roots, and the decomposed organic matter that makes soil fertile and able to support new life. His cruelty feeds the land now, his body broken down and distributed through earth and plant and insect, in endless cycle of transformation that turns even evil into something that can nurture growth. That's justice too, Isabella would say if she could speak from beyond the grave where she rests now, far from Wexford Plantation but never free of its memory. That's the earth's way of teaching that nothing is wasted, that even the worst of us eventually becomes useful, that time and patience and the slow grinding work of decomposition can transform anything, can take the most hardened evil and break it down into components simple enough to be reconstructed into something better. The lessons remain, carried in the blood and memory of descendants who've never seen ant mounds or cotton fields or slave quarters, but who carry in their DNA the accumulated wisdom of ancestors who survived the unsurvivable. They carry Isabella's patience, her endurance, her knowledge that suffering doesn't have to be the end of the story, that it can be the beginning of transformation if you're strong enough, brave enough, connected enough to forces larger than individual suffering or individual revenge. Who suffered, and the suffering was real, was documented, was witnessed by earth and sky and creatures great and small. Who resisted, left memory that outlasts marble monuments and written history, that lives in oral tradition and spiritual practice and the accumulated wisdom of people who've learned that survival itself is a form of resistance, that maintaining your humanity in inhumane conditions is the most powerful rebellion possible. And that memory, that testimony, that story of Isabella of the Ants who endured 200 torments and transformed her torture into triumph, who taught the earth itself to be her ally and tiny insects to be her army, who survived long enough to walk into freedom with her head high and her spirit unbroken, that memory we guard here, in the souls of slavery, where stories like these are kept alive so that future generations will know. Your ancestors were fierce, were patient, were ultimately undefeatable, and so are you.